and the thing about Southern hip hop is that they didn't really get a lot of radio play early on, and during the rise of hip hop. Of course, there was like New York bias that we always say that they just didn't play Southern hip hop in New York like
when I hear y'all say that, man, let me pull this up.
We can get into it.
When I hear y'all say that,
yeah.
I gotta ask you honestly, do you really feel like the music of that time, outside of Dungeon Family, was wide reaching enough? I remember being down there because I used to go to Atlanta every summer to see, shout out to Aunt Rosie and Shireen and Halima and Omar. It's Omar's birthday tomorrow, so but I'm like, the stuff that was playing was Show They Freak a Little Song, and like Yin Yang Twins before they pop, and Whistle While You Twerk, and I just don't know if that stuff would have even had legs outside of the South. It reminds me of like the Locks.
Okay.
On a street level, maybe Street Cats might bump them on some mixtapes and stuff, but they're not hitting numbers outside of New York like that. And that's the feeling. Or certain Wu-Tang members, right? I just feel like Killer Army might not have made it down south, except for off the strength for maybe having that W on there. But in all honesty, I mean, Raheem, Kilo, you really feel like that stuff would have reached the West Coast and the East Coast markets like that? Would rappers thinking like that?
Well, the thing is this. So you gotta understand, Outkast was booed in New York. So this is what people are calling like the greatest hip hop group in the history of hip hop. They were booed in New York, the 95 Source Award. So it's like, I think in a sense, when it came to Southern music, you understand, like, me being a lover of hip hop since day one, it's just like, I think New York just saw it as their own, and it's something it's kind of like, when you have like, and Common kind of did it. He kind of did what I used to love her, like, he kind of made it a love song where it's like you see this woman that you love growing up, and she's your girl, and then she goes to other places, and you got this kind of sense of like jealousy of like, man, this used to be my girl, and now she's like in the West Coast, now she's down south, and it's like, I think for the overall feel of New York, because it wasn't just like, maybe these songs won't resonate. They didn't even give an opportunity. Like, you wouldn't hear Outkast in the 90s on Hot 97. Like, they just wouldn't, they didn't really, unless, I think, and you can tell me this better, I don't think they didn't really start playing Outkast until like Aquemini. I don't think they played like Southern Playalistic too much on New York radio in 94, 95. So it's like, I think Southern music just didn't really get that opportunity a lot of times from because you have to understand, New York was the media capital as well, and it's the record label capital. So it's like, to get signed to a major, you got to go through New York to get into like.
I think
about it.
I think the South was just a new market, because I think both West and East was self-contained. Like West, they got their own artists since Ice-T and NWA broke the door down, and
you gotta think, like, you gotta think Interscope is out on the West Coast,
right? So I don't think they were bumping. So New York radio, 94, 95, they're playing Mobb Deep singles. They probably should not have made it to the radio because they weren't really singles. But I don't think those songs were getting played on the West Coast either. They were playing anything that had Wu-Tang on it. I don't think those songs were getting played on the West. I think those times of hip hop were very self-contained, since the South was such a new market. It had to show itself. There were Southern rappers since the 80s, but as a market where you can point out 10 major Southern artists, that was few and far between. And so UGK had been out, 8Ball and MJG had been out, but they were still on this like B level where they weren't even really getting radio play outside of their major market. So it was, Outkast really did more for the South than they get credit for, because they really put it on radio. And New York, I don't think we had that mind. I don't think we had the mind of it's mine. I just don't think we knew y'all existed. That's really the thing.
That's the worst, because it was like ignored, like,
right. And we didn't care where people were from. In the early 90s, on the radio station, I'm hearing the mix. I'm hearing Today Was a Good Day by Ice Cube. I'm hearing Mind Playing Tricks on Me by Ghetto. No one cared where anyone was from. We didn't know where the UMCs were from. We didn't know where Kwame was from. It was just playing.
When you mentioned a cut like Mind Playing Tricks on Me and Ice Cube, those are like outliers. Like NWA, Dre, Ghetto Boys, those are outliers. So it's like, you know, Mind Playing Tricks on Me was something that just like resonated nationally, which was something that was unheard of back then. That
and in every party they're gonna play some 2 Live Crew. They're gonna play Doodoo Brown. Like there was I think the East Coast West Coast also created that tension. Whenever I look at that Source Awards and I look at why Outkast was getting booed, I'm like, well, that was just a hater ass room. There was so much tension, and I think people weren't booing Outkast because they were Outkast. They were booing them because, again, they didn't know who they were compared to the other names that were named for New Artists of the Year. And I remember when I'm like, who are these dudes? And I remember when I used to go to Atlanta in '94, they were playing Benz and Beamer on the radio. Benz and Beamer, right? I love that song, but I thought it was Das Effects. My New York mind was like, who is this? I'm like, is this a new Das Effects song? And what Atlanta was playing predominantly was West Coast music. Like it, you know, I think in '96 you started hearing No Limit cuts come on the radio. My cousins were telling me about Shireen. She was like, they got this song down here called I'm Bout It, Bout It. And the other song they would tell me about is Sprinkle E40. And I'm like, I was dying to hear East Coast cut. When I was down there in '96, it was Do or Die, Po Pimp on the radio. It was Benz a Beamer. But again, back up north, '96 started becoming a more segmented time in radio, where before we didn't care where people were from. Now we had to put it through the Battle of the Beats test. I remember they put Crossroads by Bone Thugs on the Battle of the Beats. They put Elevators on the Battle of the Beats. Elevators made it, so we got a little bit of radio play. They were playing AT-Aliens on the DJ shows, but not like they were playing Wu-Tang and Biggie, right? So I think, to your point, I'm sorry, not to go off on the tangent because we really got into it, but I'm like, New York didn't care until the East Coast, West Coast. Then after that, everybody got criticized harder than they ever would before. And I think the reason it wasn't happening in the early to mid 90s is because there wasn't enough wide-reaching music. I think a lot of what Ball and G were making was very Southern. 666, very Southern. Kilo and whatever they were doing in Miami, bass stuff, too Southern to really go to hella markets.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think so. Like, if you to that point, it's like even in Atlanta, like you would hear Big, you would hear Mobb Deep in Atlanta, and I think a lot has to do with we had Radio One set up shop down in Atlanta. So that was like 95 when Radio One came. Before that, we had V103. That was like the only black urban radio station. And V103 wouldn't even play rap music. They were playing like R&B. You would have to hear Sweat.
It was like y'all BLS, y'all WBLS.
Yeah, like they would play like Keith Sweat and and Guy and So I think for you're right, for the most part, like Southern hip hop just didn't have outlets, right? Like you would really have to go to like these weird mom and pop record stores to get these tapes of these down south artists because they just didn't. It was hard to find. Like it was hard to find. Like we can think about Memphis artists like Player Fly, Skinny Pimp. They like Memphis had this whole movement where you could only get these tapes at these mom and pop record stores, and so you're right. I think in a sense it was like a lot of when you think about national radio. They just I don't know if it was ignoring. We always think it. We took it as a slight because it was like, we're making great music, but no one is like paying attention. No one, and it's just like what Andre said. It's like we got a demo, no one want to listen to it. Like he said that at the Source Awards, it's like, the South got something to say, and it's like that was like, man, that was almost like he dropped an atomic bomb on hip hop.
That didn't resonate till years later as the youngest started digging up.
It was kind of like.
When that happened, it just happened, and nobody talked about it. But years later, people talk about it.
It's kind of like he set in motion. Like, it's like he almost planted this seed, and it was like, the South got something to say, and then just like maybe like 5 or 6 years later, Southern music just takes over from a national standpoint, where it's like, you know, you think about the early 2000s and how Southern hip hop basically, man, it became to a point where it was like you had New York artists rapping over Southern beats, where you had Dipset, they weren't rapping over the traditional, you know, primo beats. They were rapping over beats that sounded like they came from Atlanta or Memphis, and it was just like, you know,
they had to do collaborations. Their work with T.I. was a big part of getting him that respect. So they got a down south audience, and he got an up north audience. He was doing a lot of appearances with Dipset around this time, right before this album dropped. I remember that piquing my ear to him. So yeah, those self-contained markets, I think that's also what makes T.I. special, because we think about, you know, out here in the Bay where I'm at, these rappers literally don't care if they get more footing outside of their area. As long as they get that regional love and they make as many sales regionally as they would on a mainstream, on a big label hitting the national market, it's like, oh, independently in my own territory, I can sell as much, so I'm good. I feel like that's what a lot of down south artists, their minds were like that. And I think about, again, I was down south looking for Smith and Wesson and Mobb Deep to be played on the radio. They might have been getting bumped, but they weren't on the radio. Right? So everybody was just in their market minded until the mid 90s. 96 was a big turning point. People were like, oh, I got to make records for these other markets. I talked about that with E40 with that album, The Sprinkle in a Major Way. I think that was the beginning of him branching out, realizing, hey man, I got shows out in the South. They feeling me out here in the Midwest. Let me, you know, make a broad appeal. And that's what makes T.I. so special, because you can tell that stuff mattered to him. He didn't really want the approval like that. He just wanted to kind of prove that he was just that ambidextrous, like, yo. And I think, again, that's what I hear on I'm Serious. He's like, I can spit. And then he kind of told
in a sense, the South and Atlanta, you know, we're looking for acceptance, because I think we felt like it's almost like that little brother syndrome. It's like, man, I know I can beat my little, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, we can take it in basketball. It's like Jordan versus the Pistons in like 87. Like, it's like, you know, look, he was little brother at that point, but it's like, you know, that you got the talent and the skill to like really operate on this level, but you feel like you're not really getting the attention or the just due. So I think you hear that in T.I. and I'm Serious, like, yo, like look at me. He's basically saying, yo, look at me. And in the attempt of saying like, look at me, is almost like he's kind of like losing himself, or not really representing himself. Versus with trap music, is like this is him. Like although he's rapping over beats that could go on the East Coast or the West Coast, it's like he's really giving you Atlanta. And I think that's when you see him really take off, is when he actually becomes himself, and he's actually comfortable with himself.
Yeah, so he's still doing the same things, but way more comfortable. It reminds me of when Wayne started doing more articulation in his verses, because they're fans and students of hip hop the same way you and I are. So at the end of the day, getting that Jay-Z nod does matter to them. So that's when you heard Wayne go from just all these kind of New Orleans kind of cadences to really wanting to be heard. Like, no, listen to me spit. So I'm gonna rap more eloquently now. Like, I remember that change distinctly when I heard Go DJ. I'm like, oh, he's not doing that. He's not doing that as much. Because before, you know, he'll tell you he was modeling BG and Juvie. Like, those were his OGs. So he was like, okay, that's all that matters is this New Orleans bounce. Then he's like, I want to be heard. The hottest nigga under the sun. I come better than, you know.
So they actually changed before their first card. I'm not sure if you remember the Squad Up mixtape.
Yes, I didn't want to get too deep into the Wayne.
Yeah, we wasn't into the weeds, but like the Squad Up tapes, it's like when Wayne is like, okay, I'm going to show y'all that I can actually spit.
Yo,
like,
people don't give Wayne his credit when they talk about the rise of artist mixtapes. It was him and 50. They always talk about 50, but this was 2001, 2002. He was doing Squad Up, so it's like, my respect. I became a Wayne fan from those tapes. I had always liked Wayne from The Block Is Hot, but like I was like, okay, he's hungry, he wants this. And so that mattered.